Good afternoon. Welcome to INSA's Wednesday Wisdom with Matt Gorham. I'd now like to play a video from our sponsor, Applied Insight.
The way we think about national security needs to change. It used to be like a chess match with our adversaries where we can predict their moves and we knew what tools they're going to use. But as the threat landscape changes, they're sometimes moving across the board faster than we can see them. So how do we handle that kind of landscape? We need to muster the same energy it took to get to the moon to solve our national security problems. But how do you do that? We need to give them a safe and secure environment where they can fail 100 times until they make that breakthrough. That is what Altitude does.
I'd now like to welcome INSA Vice President for Policy, Larry Hanauer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this installment of INSA's Wednesday Wisdom. We're pleased to host one of the intelligence community's top leaders this afternoon. Before we begin, let me make a few housekeeping notes. First, we hope to make this as interactive as possible. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Second, we're pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today. So as a reminder, this program is on the record. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Applied Insight, for their critical support of this program. We could not deliver this kind of thought leadership without the support of our partners. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Gabriel Alix, Applied Insight's Vice President of Intelligence, who will introduce our speaker. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's so critical for us to remain connected during these challenging times. So thank you so much to INSA for putting this program together. Applied Insights is a proud supporter of INSA, and we help federal customers solve pressing technology challenges. Our Altitude platform provides a fast and secure cloud infrastructure that is turnkey and sets up in a matter of days and helps to meet some of national security customers' remote work needs. Altitude is a secure environment that allows innovation and experimentation for cyber solutions, software development, and general research. INSA programs like these foster so much needed dialogue around national security issues and critical to keeping our community connected. Now it is my privilege to announce today's speaker. As Assistant Director of the FBI Cyber Division, Matt Gorham helped lead the national effort to investigate and prosecute internet crimes, including cyber-based terrorism, espionage, computer intrusion, and major cyber fraud. Previously, he served as special agent in charge for the counterterrorism division at the Washington Field Office. Matt joined the FBI in 1995 and was the first assigned to the Pittsburgh Field Office, where he worked a variety of violations with an emphasis on violent crime and drug investigations before moving over and focusing on counterterrorism matters. So thank you so much, Matt, and over to you, Larry.
Great. Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you to Applied Insight for supporting today's program. Matt, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're grateful for all the Bureau does to keep the government and the nation safe from cyber attacks, and we appreciate your willingness to spend some time with us today.
Absolutely. Really happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So let me start with some questions about the FBI's new cyber strategy, which the Bureau just recently launched. Can you give us an overview of what the strategy entails?
Sure. I think before I go right into the strategy, I just kind of want to shape it by describing some of the threats as we see it. And so I think from our perspective, the most concerning threats involve foreign actors using global infrastructure to compromise U.S. networks. When we look at and frame that, we're very concerned about the increase in the number of vulnerabilities, particularly those that go unpatched for years. We've seen an increase in demonstrated willingness by our adversaries to use and exploit those vulnerabilities. We've seen an increase in the proliferation of tools, many available on the dark web. And we've seen an overall increase in the number of actors that are engaged in the space, particularly as the bar to entry has been lowered. 20 years ago, if you wanted to be a hacker, you had to be pretty technical. In today's environment, you can purchase those tools and utilize them without any technical knowledge whatsoever. So as we look at that and we think about our adversaries constantly looking to exploit perceived vulnerabilities or gaps in our system, so that is gaps between foreign and domestic authorities, gaps between national security and criminal threat actors, gaps between the government and private sector, we knew as we sat down to think through the strategy, when we thought about what the FBI's role in this fight would be, it was going to hinge on our relationship with our partners. And so if you describe the cyber ecosystem with, imagine a spectrum on the left-hand side, those parts of the government and the private sector engaged in defensive activity. So think CISA, think the parts of DoD that do net defense, think about the private sector who has operates and has primary responsibility for defense for 90% of our critical infrastructure. And if you think about the right-hand side of that spectrum, our IC partners, so that is the CIA, the NSA, DoD, most often in the form of cybercom, and we're seated right in the middle of that ecosystem. And with respect to criminal cyber matters, with our very good partners at the United States Secret Service, and with respect to counterintelligence cyber matters, with our military counterintelligence organization partners, so Army Intel, Air Force OSI, and NCIS. And the three things we really do in that center space are we conduct investigations, we collect intelligence, and we engage with partners. Sometimes those are governmental partners, sometimes they're private sector partners, sometimes they're victims. And we do all three of those things with a focus on attribution. And so what we realized is what we really can bring to that table is that attribution piece. And so we want to use that attribution, which I think is essential to any tool or instrument of national power we want to exercise to stop this activity in furtherance of the overall government strategy. And so we could very easily operate in the center of that ecosystem in our own lane and just slowly and methodically work our way to an indictment, for example. But what we really want to do is, in a sequenced way, at speed, release indicators of compromise with our government partners and our private sector partners. Look for ways the private sector can work with us on the matters we're working. Work with our IC and DoD partners for them to take actions in their space and do all of those things at speed in a sequenced way, both enabling others' operations and doing things jointly to have the maximum impact on the adversary. And so in terms of a vision for what we're trying to achieve, we really want to have safety, security, and confidence in our digitally connected world. I want to focus in on the mission statement for a moment because I think that really goes to the core of the strategy. That is, we want to impose risk and consequence on our cyber adversaries through our unique authorities, our world-class capabilities, and our enduring partnerships built on a century of innovation. And I really want to focus on that imposing risk and consequences because I think ultimately cyber is the ultimate team sport. And we really got to come together with all our partners if we want to impose the maximum risk and consequence. Key to the strategy is where we do that. And that's the National Joint Cyber Investigative Task Force. It was set up in 2008 under NSPD 54 and HSPD 23, and it was designed to be that hub of cyber investigative coordination and integration and sharing. And so we have more than 30 partners out there from across the IC and the government, as well as some of our Five Eye partners. And what we're really trying to do there is come together, build whole of government campaigns against those threat actors in a way that we collectively can impose the greatest risk and consequence on those adversaries to deter that activity. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, deter the activity that's taking place.
Okay. Can you give us some examples of what imposing risk and consequences looks like in practice? What do those really mean?
Sure. I think, one of the things that probably is most associated with the FBI are indictments that stem from FBI investigations. So that's one form of risk and consequence, but it may take other forms as well. So for example, it might be a cybersecurity advisory. Most recently, we did one with our good partners up at NSA on Drover, taking away a sophisticated adversary's latest tool and thereby imposing consequence on them because they'd have to recreate that. So I think that's an example of where we've done that with a partner. We've also done a number of PSAs and cybersecurity advisories with CISA jointly. And we continue to do flashes and pins over time that we do organically in the FBI. I think over the last 2 months, we've had in excess of 20 different advisories that have gone out to inform the public, to inform the private sector about what the threat is and what they can do about it. I think it may take the form of working with our Treasury partners on sanctions and providing sanctions. And it may take the form of something you don't see, and that is the activity that we conduct with our IC partners and our DoD partners in furtherance of the mission. But I think suffice to say, when you see an indictment by the FBI, it's going to be a rare case when there's not a lot of activity with our partners holistically against that threat on the sides, whether that be seen or unseen.
Right. So it sounds like some of the approach might be imposing different sorts of penalties on these actors other than indictments, like sanctions, for example, in coordination with the Treasury Department. And some of it might be basically taking the wind out of their sails, right, by preventing them from using a particular tool or raising awareness about a particular threat, so people can defend themselves better. I mean, those are those two critical components of the effort?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. So you mentioned indictments. Now, indictments, particularly of actors that are backed by nation states, are often kind of disparaged as just naming and shaming, since a lot of the individuals or organizations that are indicted are beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. So when you do choose to pursue an indictment, what's the value of those indictments? What's the value of that step if you can't get your hands on the person or take direct penalties against the organization?
Sure. I think first and foremost, I don't think anybody's beyond the reach of the FBI. We have a long memory and we continue to pursue. I actually don't like the term name and shame. I'd prefer a term something like attribute and pursue, because that's what we ultimately do. There's nothing says attribution like an indictment, and we have a long memory and continue to pursue those that have been indicted and we have charges on. But I think sometimes with indictments, we end up focusing on the tactical and the operational level. That is, we focus in on the threat actor or actors that were indicted and whether they themselves continued or discontinued their nefarious activity. But an indictment, particularly as a nation on a nation state, is another opportunity to message, particularly at the strategic and political level of that nation state adversary, what we find to be counter-normative and destabilizing. And so when we see that behavior, we have an opportunity to message that. And so, we'll take a case, for example, with China. I think as we continue to release indictments about the activity either condoned by or sponsored by China, it becomes increasingly difficult for an actor like China to be seen as a trusted and dependable partner around the globe, thereby taking away their potential soft power, because soft power is less effective when it comes with the jagged edge of cyber intrusions.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about China and other potential adversaries in the cyberspace. So as you mentioned, you talked about China. China is using cyber tools to steal U.S. intellectual property. Russia is targeting U.S. critical infrastructure and spreading disinformation intended to divide American society. And then transnational criminal groups are stealing Americans' personal data for profit. So how does the new strategy address the threats specifically coming from China and Russia and transnational organizations who are capable of cyber?
Sure. I think if you look at the strategy, you should think of the strategy as a frame by which we operate against each one of these threats, because there are going to be threat-specific strategies on each individual threat. For example, imposing risk and consequence may look very different when it's the Chinese Communist Party and engaging in some type of nefarious activity than it would if it was a Russian-speaking Eastern European cyber criminal syndicate or Iran or a Russian intelligence service. And so every single threat is going to have a different type of risk and consequence. And that's what takes place at the NCI JTF. Those discussions with our interagency partners, laying out whole government campaigns in a series of blows against those adversaries that are shaped to that specific threat.
So what are the principal differences between what the Bureau is going to do under the new strategy and what you were doing before? Is the biggest tangible difference the whole of government approach that's fostered by working through the NCI-JTF as an interagency center of activity?
I think there are two things, and that's certainly one of them. I think first off, I'd want to say this is not a revolutionary strategy. It's evolutionary. It's built upon the successes we've had institutionally as the FBI and our partners have had. And so I think the two differences you're likely to see as tangible results are, one, an increased focus on imposing risk and consequence. So how can we deter that adversary from conducting the activity? Secondly, to your point, the NCI-JTF is that hub or vehicle by which we can bring all the interagency together, all of our private sector partners, our government and beyond partners together to have a holistic ability to address that threat. And so I think those are probably the two things that you'll tangibly see. But again, this is not a revolutionary shift or a total change in cardinal direction. This is building upon the solid work that we've done as a community over the years and just trying to improve upon it.
Yeah. And what's the advantage of working through the NCI-JTF? Is it promoting greater information sharing among the different agencies that are engaged in addressing the threat? Is it drawing on different legal authorities that members of the law enforcement and the intelligence communities have? I mean, why shift the resources and why shift the focus of activity to the NCI-JTF?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. It's the bringing together of all the tools and authorities in a single location. So 30 plus organizations represented there. Now we've made an investment in the FBI. The first thing we did is we elevated the position of director of the NCI-JTF up to my deputy for operations. And so we've significantly increased the rank of the leader. That way, when that individual as the director of the NCI-JTF is writing a check, he can cash that check as the FBI operational lead. Secondly, we reorganized the NCI-JTF along a mission center line. And why we did that is our partners are very much organized in that mission center too. So we'll have a China DPRK mission center, a criminal mission center, Iran Russia mission center. And then we went out to our partners and solicited seniors from our partners to lead. So an example is the criminal mission center is led by a deputy assistant director from the United States Secret Service. So we have an SES billet, second level SESer at the NCI-JTF leading that criminal mission center. And then lastly, we co-located our FBI operations within the NCI-JTF. And so sitting side by side is my lead for criminal cyber matters, sitting right next to the mission center. And the synergy that comes with sitting side by side, having daily conversations about the nature of the threat, how we may be able to mitigate the threat, and what we can do together, I think provides a bounty that we weren't necessarily getting when we weren't all together like that.
Yeah, no, that's an important operational reform. I want to talk, since we've been talking about information sharing among government agencies, I also want to talk about information sharing between the government and the private sector, particularly the defense industrial base. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to take a poll of those of you in the audience to get some perspectives from you before Matt answers this next question on information sharing. It's been difficult for the Bureau and other government agencies to persuade companies and universities and other non-government entities to share information when they get hit by a cyber attack, because many organizations have concerns about legal liability, about damage to their brands, or maybe even the impact on their stock price. So we'd like to get insights from Matt on how the FBI is encouraging organizations to come forward when they're attacked. But before we do that, let's take a quick poll of how likely audience members are to come forward. So you see the question on your screen: how likely is your organization to contact the FBI or the Secret Service if it were to suffer a cyber attack or a ransomware attack? So please select one of the options: very likely, likely, somewhat likely, unlikely, or very unlikely, just so we can get your perspective. This is all anonymous, so don't worry, you're not representing your organization's official views. We're just trying to get a sense of how people view the threat and how people view the potential benefits versus the costs of coming forward to the government. So if you select one of those options, we'll give it just about 4 or 5 more seconds for you to do so, and then we'll close the poll right about now. So let's take a look at what the results were. if we can display those. So we've got 71% very likely or likely to come forward. That's good. That suggests the Bureau and your interagency colleagues have been successful in your outreach. But then there's about 10% that are not likely to come forward and about 20% that are kind of in the middle. So there's still some work to be done. So, so Matt, what is the Bureau doing to encourage those 30% of organizations that aren't so sure of the benefits to come forward and share the details of a cyber attack with the Bureau or the Secret Service or other law enforcement agencies?
Sure. I think, first and foremost, the last time you want to meet the FBI is after an incident has occurred. So I think it's very important that we have those enduring relationships and robust relationships before an incident occurs. And so our 56 field offices out there are building those robust and enduring relationships in the field with our private sector partners. Every field office in the country has a private sector liaison who's responsible for that activity. At the national level, we have our Office of the Private Sector, who operates programs such as DSAC and InfraGard, which I know many of the members or the viewers today are members of. And then specifically on cyber, we do a few things. And so we have co-located and worked very closely with two nonprofits in particular. The first is the most recent, which is the National Defense Cyber Alliance in Huntsville, Alabama, where we're co-located, and that's really an effort focused on the DIB. The other place we do that very robustly and have for a long time is at the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance, both in Pittsburgh and New York, as well as Los Angeles. And that's where we have the private sector sitting side by side, FBI agents and Secret Service agents, talking through the threats of the day in a way that allows us to very quickly, very nimbly address those threats that come up. I think, when you think about our strategy and you wonder, sharing with the private sector, is it key to our strategy or not? And one, it is. And I think the unit within our the cyber division at FBI headquarters is actually called the Mission Critical Engagement Unit. I think the name says it all. And they do things like sponsor the CISO Academy that we run a couple of times a year. They'll sponsor regional cyber summits where we bring the private sector and the public sector together to have those conversations. Again, I think we're always going to recognize that companies need to make business decisions, particularly around an intrusion. I think what I would ask for is for anybody who is a victim to call law enforcement, call the FBI, call the Secret Service, and I'm agnostic who you call. I mean, if you call the Secret Service, it's like calling the FBI, and if you call the FBI, it's like calling the Secret Service. Call who you're comfortable with, call who you have the relationship with, but have law enforcement at the table. We know how to work with victims. We know how to show up and not wear raid jackets and come into the office and be disruptive. And a law enforcement response to a cyber incident and mitigation is not mutually exclusive. We can do both things. And that law enforcement response may give you opportunities to help protect yourself in that very instance or in the future. And so I'd ask everybody to please call law enforcement when they have an incident.
Great, that's great advice. I want to move on to some other topics beyond just the cyber strategy. I will note that we have a 2-page fact sheet on the Bureau's new cyber strategy that's available for download. If you look on the right side of your screen under handouts, you can click on the Bureau's the fact sheet for the Bureau's cyber strategy. There's also some information about INSA while you're there. So if you do need a little bit of information in writing, you can download that document. So I do want to get to an audience question that touches on the topic we were just discussing about information sharing. This question's from Matt Gord, and he asks, what can the private sector do to create a better collaboration environment with the Bureau as your front line for critical infrastructure?
I actually know Matt, and we worked together in years past. I think understanding our culture and equities and our ability to sit down and build that relationship on the front end and understand that companies or private sector entities, culture and equities is key to it. Because if we break down those barriers and we actually understand what the partner, and it is very much a partnership, needs to achieve, we're going to come up with better solutions. And so, as I was saying, trying to form those enduring and robust relationships early on, it's always more difficult when something's happened and the equities are at play than before the fact.
Okay. And since you mentioned the Huntsville facility, we've got a question from Thomas Krall asking, will Huntsville become the center of excellence for cybersecurity for the FBI?
So it's interesting. So that's the second FBI alum that's asked a question. So maybe we have a lot of former FBI alums in the audience today. So we have a rapidly expanding footprint at Huntsville. There's more than 1,600 acres of campus that we're developing. It is going to be a center of analytics for the FBI and resiliency. We've realized over time that we don't have to centralize everything in a single location, but we can have a diffuse network of facilities. So we're going to continue to grow that. But I think one thing I will note is we're not new to Redstone Arsenal. We've actually been there since 1971. Our hazardous devices school, which trains every single public safety bomb technician in the country, is run out of Huntsville. In 2016, we took that completely over. We had been in a partnership with the Army from 71 to 2016, and now run that school unilaterally. I will say it is one of the best kept gems in the law enforcement and public safety community. We've run more than 20,000 bomb technicians through that school since 1971, and every bomb technician in the country is interoperable because they all go to the exact same school. And so we'll continue to build that footprint. Specifically with cyber, what we're moving down to Huntsville is, in addition to the NDCA, which is located in Huntsville, we're moving our training facility down there. And the decision to move that down there, as I was thinking about it, the idea of moving something to Huntsville was focused on, can we make the mission better if we do it? Well, when we're moving to Huntsville, we were going to get a state-of-the-art training facility, a world-class cyber range, and put those two things together with a world-class curriculum and our great instructors. We're going to have that center of training excellence for cyber in Huntsville, due to open in the spring of 2023.
Now, Huntsville also has a pretty high-tech workforce in place, in part because of some of the other government agencies that are there. Are you going to be able to draw on some of the high-tech talent that's already present there, or are you expecting to move people around? How are you going to manage the workforce down in Huntsville?
There will be some folks that move down to Huntsville. It's a popular place. It's a good cost of living and a nice town for sure, but certainly want to capitalize on the talent that's there, both generating from the schools there, as well as folks that are already living and working in the community. Yeah. So we've had a number of recruiting events trying to bring people into the FBI. And again, we're no stranger to Redstone, so we're a known quantity, and we're continuing to work with the community.
Great. So I want to ask some questions about something that is obviously affecting all of us and at the top of everyone's mind, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic's only broadened the attack space for malicious cyber actors who are targeting both government and industry organizations. A lot of people are working from home. They have less secure networks. A lot of things have changed for just the way people do business, and it's increased people's cyber vulnerabilities. So how do you think the pandemic has impacted the cyber environment, and how is the Bureau responding?
Sure. I think, there was a brief moment in time where we all hoped that the criminals would not take advantage of a crisis, but history tells us they will continue to do that, and that's what we've seen with the pandemic. IC3, which is our internal internet complaint center, their complaints have more than quadrupled since the pandemic started. So that is cyber criminals taking advantage of people's fears, the increase in attack surface to conduct their activity. And so we've certainly seen that, and we've addressed that as it's come up. With the nation state actors, we've seen nation state actors targeting COVID research. Certainly you've seen from us the joint PSA with CISA on that activity, and most recently our July indictment, where we indicted PRC Guangdong State Security Director at Actors for doing exactly that, conducting exfil of COVID research. I think in terms of our workforce, that's the biggest impact, because at the end of the day, we got a lot of American citizens that have to deal with all the same problems everybody else is, but we have a need to be in the office and get the work done. And so we've figured out ways to be flexible. We've been able to do things virtually that we were never built or designed to do. And so there's been a lot of innovation in trying to get those things done. And at the end of the day, I think the American public should rest assured we're all here. We're getting the job done. We're imposing that risk and consequence each and every day.
Great. Now we have a lot of people from industry listening in today, and so I want to ask a question about private sector innovation. In a speech that Director Ray gave in Boston in March at a conference, he said that the Bureau should institutionalize innovation. So what are the Bureau's highest priority technology and innovation requirements in the cyber arena? And how can the private sector help the Bureau satisfy those needs?
Sure. I think, innovation is the heart of the Bureau. The FBI itself was an innovation when it was created more than 100 years ago. We've seen as the threats have changed over time, we've innovated. The FBI lab, fingerprints, biometrics, enterprise theory of investigation. As things come along, the Bureau has always been a hub of innovation, and it is certainly a priority for Director Ray. It's one of the things he looks through, and he looks at the Bureau to see where we can innovate. We actually have within the FBI an innovation office that its sole function is to try to institutionalize that innovation within the FBI. I think in terms of understanding our technological challenges, that office will be putting out a broad agency announcement in the near future that'll really kind of focus in on those high-level tech challenges that we focus, looking for the academia and the private sector to provide insight and research and solutions to those challenges we have. Not to get out ahead of them, but certainly we have challenges around data analytics, about AI and machine learning, and we'll have a fulsome discussion of that in the broad agency announcement that should be out shortly.
Great. Okay. I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to look out for that. Another question that I know a lot of private companies are grappling with is the question of active defense. So some companies that have lost data to cyber criminals have explored the notion of active defense or hacking back to reclaim their data, despite the fact that these kinds of activities fall into somewhat of a legal gray area. So how does the FBI work with companies that are interested in pursuing such an approach? And do you discourage them from hacking back, or do you offer other alternatives?
Yeah, I want to be abundantly clear that we neither recommend or condone hacking back. And I think most companies, when they look at return on investment or value for the activity they're taking place, would be much better off if they invested in traditional cyber defenses and practices rather than trying to regain data that's already been expelled. And so I would certainly discourage that, and I would never advocate for it.
Okay, great. Let me turn to some more audience questions. So we've got one from Irina Levine, who asks, the cyber attack surface has expanded significantly with the spread of IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. So how does the Bureau work with CISA and other agencies to mitigate the risk posed by insecure devices that are connected to the internet?
Certainly. We have a cadre of analysts that look at new technology as it comes along, look at vulnerabilities and the threat actors' use of those vulnerabilities, and then work with our interagency partners to push that information back out. So, for example, we may take a look at a new technology that is being utilized. We'll work very closely, oftentimes with CISA, and then we'll do some type of joint advisory with CISA to get that information out to the public. Technology is always advancing faster than we really understand the security implications and the risk associated with it. So there's a little bit of catch up that always takes place, but we're actively working with our partners to get that information out.
Okay, great. We have another question about the Solarium Commission report. How do you feel like the recommendations of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission will change the landscape regarding cyber investigations and the use of intelligence for investigations and information sharing between government agencies and with industry?
I think, as you look at our strategy, it's very much in line with the Solarium Commission recommendations. I think two areas in the Solarium Commission that really reflect exactly what we're trying to do are the language regarding the bolstering of the NCI-JTF as that vehicle to do that interagency coordination. And then secondly, the cyber ALAT. So around the globe, we have legal attachés in other countries. In those offices and in 13 different locations around the world, we have cyber assistant legal attachés. And those assistant legal attachés work very closely with the host nation on these joint investigations or in support of those countries. And so cyber is an ultimate team sport, and it's a global sport. And so it's essential that we have folks overseas engaged in that. And enhancing that program was one of the recommendations of the Cyber Solarium. So I think from an FBI perspective, it very much marries with what we're trying to achieve. And I look forward to some of the other results.
That's great. That's a great innovation. I know in a previous life, I managed to visit a number of ALAT offices overseas, and just having people affiliated with the offices who really have a subject matter expertise in cyber has got to increase the ability to coordinate investigations and information sharing with partner governments.
It absolutely does. The speed by which we can do that, informal law enforcement to law enforcement exchange to work jointly on cases is a game changer in the space. I don't think I can think of a single cyber investigation in my tenure in the last 2 years where we haven't had an international aspect to it and a legal attaché engaged.
So speaking of the international aspect, we have a question from Jim Cox asking if you've had any recent cases involving combined action with Canadian partners to counter threats to North America generally.
So we work very closely with our Canadian partners. We have those Canadian partners at the NCI JTF. They sit in space with us. We work together jointly on whatever matters, be they nation state or criminal matters that need to be addressed. And so very close working relationship with all the Five Eyes countries.
And are there other Five Eyes partners that sit in the NCI JTF?
Absolutely, every single one of them.
That's great. That's great. Here we have a question from Adam Gruber, who asks, what role do you see cloud computing playing, if any, as a tool in the cyber division specifically and in the larger FBI enterprise as a whole? So I guess, how does the cloud not only expand the attack surface, but how does that perhaps give you additional resources for conducting investigations or imposing consequences on adversaries?
Sure. I think I will defer the kind of traditional IT side of that, because we're an operational division of the FBI focused on investigating and conducting intelligence operations regarding intrusions as opposed to providing infrastructure. Certainly, cloud computing is going to be of a benefit to the FBI writ large in our IT infrastructure. With respect to the threat, it certainly expands the surface, the attack surface, and we're very much looking at those managed services and cloud services and how adversaries can really kind of double down on their efforts and get in one location and have multiple victims. And so it certainly adds complexity to the threat.
Okay. We have a question here from Eric Geller of Politico, and he asks that one of the failures of the pre-9/11 era was the lack of information sharing between the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, including the Bureau. So hopefully that's changed since the 9/11 attacks, given all the reforms that have been instituted. But how confident are you that information sharing won't close down in the cyber realm? And what cultural changes give you that confidence?
So this is my 25th year in the FBI. So I lived through the changes that the Bureau had post 9/11. And so I saw that shift from a much more reactive, though not totally reactive footprint, to a much more proactive stance with respect to CT. And I would say, as an intelligence community, and certainly within the FBI, we've learned the lessons of 9/11. And so information sharing is key to what we do. I think when we look at a piece of information, kind of a fundamental principle for us is who else needs to know this? And it's always, traditionally we would look at something and say, does anybody else really need to see this? And so that's been a shift that we've learned through CT, and it's carried through into the cyberspace as well. There's not a day goes by that I don't receive information from all of our IC partners that we're not in collaborative space, having joint meetings these days virtually, but we're certainly engaged, and I feel really confident in our ability to share information back and forth.
That's great. We have about 5 minutes left, so let me ask about one other topic we haven't touched on really, and that's the workforce. We talked about a little bit in the context of Huntsville, but the government writ large has difficulty developing, recruiting, retaining technical talent, in part because of pay scales and a range of other challenges. Security clearances, of course, are an obstacle to getting people into the workforce. So how is the FBI building its cyber workforce, both by recruiting new people and working to retain them? And then to add to that, let me add a question from a student, Roinda Hartsfield, who asks what areas she should focus on if she wants to pursue a career in cyber in the intelligence community.
So I think I am aware that it's difficult to hire technical talent, right? The private sector is hiring, the government's hiring, everybody needs that cyber talent for sure. And I will acknowledge up front that the FBI will never be able to compete with the private sector in a monetary compensation kind of way. But at the end of the day, I think the FBI mission is something that I'll compete against anybody on, because doing good for a living is something that it's difficult to put a monetary or cap on that. And so when I think about why I came in the FBI 25 years ago, it was to be part of something bigger in myself, to do good for a living, to be able to help the American public. And so that's kept me here years after I was eligible to retire. And so I think that's reflected in our attrition rate. Our attrition rate for agents working cyber in the FBI is 0.4. And
Wow.
so I'm be willing to bet that any private sector company out there would do cheetah flips to be able to have that type of attrition rate. And so for me, that's indicative of the dedication of the workforce that we get. There's no doubt that there's a challenge on the front end, particularly bringing folks in with that robust technical experience. And so as a result, we've had to spend a significant amount of effort in conducting aptitude testing and doing a lot of onboard training to get the workforce up to a level where we want them. But I think we've found a formula where not everybody that works cyber needs a master's degree in computer science. At the end of the day, what we do in cyber is a human endeavor. It requires interpersonal skills, the ability to sit down and talk to people. It does require technical talent as well, but we have sufficient talent on our cyber squads to do both things. And so I feel really good about our recruiting, and I feel even better about our retention.
Great. And then if someone wants to join the Bureau in the cyber field, what kind of things should they focus on? If they don't need that master's in computer science, what else can they be doing?
Sure, I think it depends on where you want to come in, because there's lots of different opportunities within the FBI. If you want to come in as a computer scientist, certainly study computer science. If you want to come in as a digital or data analyst, that's a good way to do it. But we hire analysts and agents across the board to work in the cyberspace. I think with respect to the agent position, I would tell them study something that they love, because they'll do well at it. And we always hire folks a little later in the career. Average age is about 30 on board as an agent. And so you'll do really well doing something you love. Go do something you love for a while and then come back to the FBI.
Great advice. So we have just a minute or two left. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
You know, again, I'd just like to thank INSA for having the opportunity to talk to us today. I think for me, the one thing that I would say is please call the Secret Service, call the FBI. If you have a cyber incident, give us a call. Oftentimes I have to make that pitch the first time. It's rare I have to do the second time, because once you've had the opportunity to work with us or work with the Secret Service, when you're in need, when you are a victim, you always call the second time, because that first experience is going to be really good. So please call if you haven't had that experience before, and form those relationships before the incident occurs.
Great. Terrific. Matt, thank you very much for your candid insights. And thank you for all that you and your colleagues at the Bureau do to keep the nation safe.
Thank you, and thanks, INSA.
And for all of you watching online, thank you for joining us as well. Once again, thank you to our sponsor, Applied Insight, for their critical support of this program. So looking ahead, next week at this time, we'll hold a special edition of Wednesday Wisdom when we welcome Sarah Megan Thomas, the writer, producer, and lead actress of the award-winning film A Call to Spy, which portrays the real-life stories of OSS operative Virginia Hall and British wireless operator Noor Inayat Khan as they operate behind enemy lines in World War II France. If you'd like, you can rent the movie on the streaming service of your choice ahead of time, which will make the discussion next Wednesday with Sarah that much more interesting. On Tuesday morning, October 20th, Rita Sampson, the IC's Chief Diversity Officer and the ODNI's Director for Equal Employment Opportunity, will join us for coffee and conversation in the morning. And on Wednesday, October 21, we welcome Katie Arrington, the CISO for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. Please visit insaonline.org for details on these events. I also want to highlight an event that INSA hosts each year to recognize outstanding intelligence professionals who have had significant impacts on national security, the INSA Achievement Awards. The 6 awards recognize accomplishments by early to mid-career government civilians, military personnel, homeland security officials, contractors, and academics, as well as the more senior professionals who mentor them. I'd encourage you to nominate a colleague, coworker, or client. The deadline for nominations is October 30, and more information on that is also available at insaonline.org. And Matt, I'll take this opportunity to encourage you to nominate some really talented young agents or analysts who work with you. When the webinar ends, there'll be a short survey that pops up. Please take a few moments to complete it and let us know how we did. This concludes today's program. Stay safe and healthy, and have a wonderful day.